So what does it say about computer science research? I can't prove it from here, but I'd say much good research is done in the software engineering domain. But sometimes one cannot tell. Pseudoscience methods often creep in. Not all the research is bad, but there's a lot that goes around. The other important message that I've learned, computer science researchers may know that scientific method, but they aren't trained as good skeptics. Every summer, CSI, the group in Amherst, New York, the Center for Skeptical Inquiry, used to be called SciCop, runs a summer program called the Skeptics Toolbox. And one of it teaches people who want to be skeptics, what do you need to look for when you're investigating various claims? And one of the scientific method is also is part of this toolbox, the things that you should know. Unfortunately, the flip side of that is not true. Skepticism is often lacking in the scientist's toolbox. Comment by James Randi. He's sort of gotten involved in this issue. Most people here, I'm sure, know James Randi, well-known magician and skeptic. He created the James Randi Educational Foundation in Fort Lauderdale to deal with pseudoscience. He claims that any such investigation of any pseudoscience not only needs scientists, but needs magicians who understand how people can be fooled. One of the things he's learned is that scientists often claim to be too smart to be fooled, which means they're often the easiest target. Because they're not trained, scientists are not trained to look for deception. Skepticism is something missing from the curriculum of any kind of scientific training, and it should be. It's not that skepticism is something different. It's a perspective on the world of how you view the scientific method, to be more aware of when things don't go right. How do we measure the science of software engineering? This is spend a little bit of time talking about the work that I did to address some of the issues I talked about. Dolores Wallace of NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology in Gaithersburg, and we reviewed, this is the work we did about 12 years ago. We looked at 650 papers, 612 papers in 1985, 90, and 95. I'll go into that study in a minute. And then several years later, we had more data, so we looked at 2000 and 2005. The first study was published in 1998. The update was published this year. How do software engineering communities justify many new technologies? And what methods do they use to validate the technologies? When you have a picture of the scientific method, what do you conjure up in your mind? And does that relate to what is actually done? And the basic conclusion we came up with is about half the papers, at least in the software engineering world, had little validation of the claims in those papers. So half the published papers on new techniques had nothing in them that really validated the technique of why it's any good or not. We first developed a 12-step program, like lots of other 12-step programs, of 12 methods for doing research or collecting data. And when you think about the scientific method, I would think most people think of number 8, the replicated experiment, where you develop many instances of a project or of an experiment, collect data, and see whether they work or not. But that's just one way of doing it. Astronomy is probably more like 1. These are worded towards the software engineering world, but the blue techniques apply across any technique. Astronomy is more like 1. You look at the sky waiting for something interesting to happen. If you're studying supernovae, you can't just say, well, we're going to blow up a few stars and watch what happens, and we'll repeat that 100 times. There are billions of stars out there. It doesn't matter if we sort of destroy a couple. We can't do that. So you basically look at the sky waiting to see what's there, and when you do see a supernova, you say, oh, we have something interesting to study. Or if you see one, you can do a case study where you kind of look at it extensively over time and seeing what happens. The search for extraterrestrial planets is pretty much that. You go to a star that's sufficiently far away, and you basically observe it and watch what happens to its light, and you try to estimate whether there are any planets circling it or not. Archaeology is more like a field study, and so on. Anyway, so we developed this list of 12 techniques for looking at engineering work research. When we started looking at published papers, we found out that those 12 don't cover every paper. So we added something we called an assertion, where someone said, I tried it and I liked it. Or I tried it 3 times, or my grad students tried it 3 times and it worked. So we call those an assertion, which meant that the authors realized they should have done some sort of validation, but they did kind of a very, very quick version of it. They just kind of did something sort of, I wouldn't say sloppy, but sort of quick to see if, does the technique have any feasibility. It's more of a feasibility study. So we call those an assertion. They don't really have any statistical significance, but they're interesting, and they at least make the author aware that some validation should have been done. So we had 13 validation methods, the 12, I'd say good ones, the assertion, and then to cover every paper, we had 2 others. One, it was not applicable. You know, sometimes journals have a paper that's just not really a research paper. It might be a tutorial on something. That explains something, or it might be a press release or an announcement of a new concept. So there were some papers that just didn't apply. They weren't sort of research contributions, and everything else we considered no experimentation. Those were papers that we felt should have had some sort of validation in them, but didn't. So we collected data. So we have data. So like any good scientist, got to show you data, lots of numbers. These are the study we did in 1995, and this is the data from the follow-up in around 2006. And this shows the first study from 85, 90, and 95. And what's important is not so much the actual numbers, is that everything is sort of clustered here, between 5 and 10% pretty much on an average for all these, except these 2. And about 19% of the papers had no experimentation when they should have, and about 32% had assertions, very sloppy kind of proof of concept. So again, 19 and 32 is about a little over 50%. And so roughly 50% of the papers had no experimentation in it. When we add on the 2006 data, or the 2005 data, which are the green bars, we'll notice that the trend is case studies increase somewhat. Assertions and no experimentation both dropped. This one increased a lot, but it was only the last 1 point we didn't count as a significant change. But the important thing to look at is the summary of the classes. The percent of papers that had validation went from 28 or 29% to about 64%, 65% over that 20-year period. So there's been a definite upward trend generally, which is a good sign, at least in the computer science world. The assertions similarly dropped from like 32% to around 21%. No experimentation, except for what I call an anomaly in 2000, has been dropping to about 10%. Looking at some papers, journals in other fields, like physics and medicine, this is never going to be 0. There's always going to be a paper written that has something interesting to say, but it hasn't been proven. So 10% seems to be a baseline that we found in other disciplines. And that's theoretical papers. So this software engineering field has been getting better. This is one of the things I've been sort of on my soapbox for the last 20 years arguing for. And in fact, the whole group at Maryland has been working on this. And I think we've had an impact. We've made the computer science world more aware of the need for validating what they're doing.